Most people go through life believing they are fully formed simply because time has passed. They assume that growing older automatically means growing wiser. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. Maturity doesn't arrive with age, it arrives with awareness. And awareness is something many people spend their entire lives avoiding. They escape from mirrors, from accountability, from the quiet moments that reveal who they truly are beneath the surface. This video exists for one purpose: to expose the internal patterns that silently weaken a person long before the world ever does. Patterns that limit potential, distort judgment, and keep someone locked inside the same emotional loops year after year, wondering why life never changes. Recognizing these signs is not about judging others. It's about understanding how the mind sabotages itself when left unexamined. One of the clearest and most universal signs of an undeveloped mind appears the moment something goes wrong: the instinct to run from responsibility. A person who has not yet built emotional strength always feels safer blaming the world instead of confronting themselves. And it doesn't matter how different the situations look on the outside: personal conflicts, career frustrations, failed goals, broken routines. Their explanations follow the same script every time. There is always someone else to accuse, always a reason that absolves them, always a story where they emerge spotless. They tell themselves these stories so often that they become part of their identity, a comforting shield against the discomfort of growth. But life becomes smaller each time someone refuses to own their part in it. Avoiding responsibility is not freedom. It is imprisonment. It traps a person in the same emotional landscape indefinitely, convincing them that everything is happening to them, never because of them. And once someone believes they are powerless, they stop trying. They stop changing. They stop risking. They settle into a passive existence where hope replaces action and excuses replace improvement. It is an invisible decay, the kind that spreads quietly because it feels safe in the moment, only revealing its full damage years later. A person who avoids responsibility often speaks in patterns that reveal this fragility. Their words are soaked in helplessness. I can't change this. This always happens to me. No one ever supports me. I just have bad luck. This is the way things are. These statements sound like truth, but they are emotional camouflage. They hide the fact that taking responsibility would require facing uncomfortable truths and doing something about them. It's not that the world never wrongs them. Everyone faces unfairness. But someone who consistently refuses responsibility treats every challenge as confirmation of their own powerlessness. They never pause long enough to consider the possibility that their decisions, habits, reactions, or avoidance contributed to the outcome. And because they never consider it, they never correct it. Life has a way of repeating lessons until they are understood. When a person avoids responsibility, the world feels cyclical. They attract the same conflicts in different friendships. They face identical frustrations in different jobs. They repeat the same emotional patterns in every relationship. The scenery changes, but they remain the same, and so the outcomes remain the same. The repetition isn't punishment. It's a mirror that they refuse to look into. Growth begins the moment a person asks one simple question: what was my part in this? That question is uncomfortable because it forces an internal shift. It challenges the mind to examine behaviors, impulses, blind spots, and assumptions. It demands maturity. And most importantly, it removes the comforting illusion that life is shaped entirely by outside forces. Once someone accepts that they have agency, they must also accept the responsibility to use it. And that responsibility weighs more than any excuse. A person who avoids responsibility often confuses accountability with blame. They think taking responsibility means admitting they are inherently flawed or permanently at fault. But responsibility is not about guilt. Responsibility is about power, the power to intervene in one's own life. It is the recognition that while you cannot control everything that happens, you can always control your choices, your discipline, your direction, and your response. That distinction separates stagnation from transformation. When someone rejects responsibility, they reject their own potential without realizing it. They choose the comfort of being right over the freedom of becoming better. They choose the safety of excuses over the challenge of evolution. And as long as they choose those things, life will stay exactly as it is. No amount of wishing, hoping, or daydreaming will make a difference until they face the truth. Nothing changes externally until something changes internally. The first sign of a weak and undeveloped mind is not ignorance. It is the refusal to own one's role in their own story. A person who avoids responsibility remains stuck in the same emotional age, no matter how many birthdays pass. And until they finally say, with honesty and clarity, "This part is on me, and I will change it," they will keep walking in circles, mistaking motion for progress and mistaking comfort for peace. Real strength begins where excuses end. Everything before that is just survival. Before we go any further, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and comment which sign you've witnessed the most in your own life or in others. Your engagement helps this message reach more people who need it. Now, let's move into a different and very revealing sign of a fragile, unexamined mind: the tendency to feel attacked by truth. Some people navigate the world as if every form of honesty were a threat. They don't fear lies. Lies are comfortable. What unsettles them is accuracy. What disturbs them is clarity. Whenever someone points out a mistake, highlights an inconsistency, or simply tells them a hard truth, they react with irritation, defensiveness, or even hostility. It's not the message that hurts them, it's the mirror. For a person who hasn't developed emotional maturity, truth feels personal. It exposes what they've avoided, challenges the image they want to project, and forces them to confront parts of themselves they keep buried. Instead of acknowledging the insight, they attack the messenger. They question the tone, the intention, or the right of the other person to even speak. Their energy is directed not toward understanding, but toward escaping the discomfort of facing themselves. You can observe this pattern in everyday situations. Correct them gently, and they immediately assume you're criticizing their entire identity. Offer a suggestion, and they interpret it as judgment. Mention a behavior, and they respond as if you were challenging their worth. Conversations with them feel like walking through a field of hidden triggers. Any small spark can ignite emotional resistance. Their inability to handle truth doesn't come from lack of intelligence. It comes from lack of inner stability. When someone is insecure about who they are, every piece of feedback feels like a threat to the fragile structure they use to protect their sense of self. They depend so heavily on preserving a certain image that even mild honesty can feel like an attack. This emotional fragility creates a dangerous loop. They reject feedback, they repeat old patterns, their problems worsen, and they defend themselves even harder. Over time, their world becomes smaller. People stop being honest with them. Friends stay silent to avoid conflict. Relationships become shallow because depth requires openness. And without honest mirrors, their misunderstandings about themselves grow stronger. They begin to believe they are always right because they have pushed away anything that challenges them. Truth becomes their enemy, and comfort becomes their compass. But comfort is not growth. Comfort is stagnation. A strong mind sees truth differently. To someone who has developed inner resilience, feedback is not an attack. It is a resource. It provides direction, correction, and perspective. It reveals blind spots that would otherwise remain hidden. Growth begins the moment someone stops asking, "Why are you criticizing me?" and starts asking, "What can I learn from this?" A mature person doesn't crumble under honesty. They absorb it. They evaluate it calmly. They take what is useful and discard what isn't, without turning the situation into a personal drama. This ability to accept truth gracefully is one of the most underrated forms of strength. It requires self-awareness, emotional stability, and humility. It means valuing growth over ego, clarity over comfort, accuracy over pride. Meanwhile, a person who rejects truth remains in a constant state of tension. They are easily embarrassed, easily threatened, easily offended. The slightest correction feels humiliating because they lack the internal foundation to hold themselves together when confronted. Instead of expanding their mind, they protect their insecurities. Instead of adjusting, they rationalize. Instead of evolving, they freeze. The deeper issue is not their reaction, it's what the reaction reveals. A person who cannot tolerate honest feedback is someone who has never built a stable relationship with themselves. They rely on external validation to feel secure, so anything that interferes with that illusion feels dangerous. Truth is painful only when the ego is fragile. People like this often claim they hate negativity, but what they actually hate is vulnerability. They despise the feeling of being seen clearly. Their discomfort is not with truth itself, it is with self-awareness. If someone tells them, "You might be wrong here," they hear, "You're not good enough." If someone says, "Consider another perspective," they hear, "You're inferior." If someone points out a habit, they hear, "You're flawed." In reality, none of these interpretations are true. They are projections of an insecure internal world. The second sign of a weak mind is not the mistake itself, but the refusal to let truth reshape behavior. It is the habit of rejecting clarity because clarity requires evolution. And evolution requires humility. Until a person learns to sit with truth, even when it stings, they remain stuck inside the small, familiar boundaries of their own ego. They will choose the comfort of flattery over the discomfort of accuracy, even if it costs them opportunities, growth, and meaningful relationships. A strong mind seeks truth, even when it disrupts comfort. A weak mind avoids it, even when it could change everything. One of the most subtle yet destructive signs of an undeveloped mind is the constant hunger for approval. Some people live as if every decision, every expression, and every movement must be validated by someone else before it feels real. Their sense of worth is built not from who they are, but from how they are seen. And because they chase admiration instead of authenticity, their life becomes a performance rather than a path. This tendency doesn't appear suddenly. It grows quietly. It begins with small compromises, adjusting an opinion to fit in, withholding an honest thought to avoid disagreement, exaggerating achievements for recognition, behaving differently around different groups. At first, these actions feel harmless. But over time, they shape a person into someone whose identity depends entirely on the reactions of others. A person who craves validation is always on stage, even when no one is watching. Their mind is filled not with questions like, "What do I believe?" or "What do I want?" but with, "How will people see me?" Every situation becomes a mirror they desperately try to control. Every conversation is an opportunity to reinforce an image. They are not living, they are curating. The danger of this mindset is not only emotional, it is existential. Once a person builds their identity around external validation, they lose the ability to act from inner alignment. Their values become negotiable. Their boundaries become inconsistent. Their choices contradict each other. They become easily manipulated by praise and discouraged by criticism, constantly adjusting themselves to whatever environment they are in. If someone compliments them, they feel confident. If someone disapproves, they feel shattered. Their emotional state rises and falls with every fluctuation in the outside world. Stability becomes impossible because their foundation is not internal. It is borrowed. Validation can be addictive. It mimics connection. It mimics progress. And because those illusions feel good, people chase them endlessly. They seek attention through appearance, status, performance, or social acceptance. They post not because they have something to say, but because they need to be seen. They speak not to express truth, but to attract approval. They seek friendships not based on depth, but on audience. This hunger slowly erodes authenticity. When a person's life revolves around being admired, they stop doing things for their own growth. They do things to maintain a reputation. Their energy goes into pleasing, impressing, and conforming. And in this pursuit, they drift further from themselves. You can easily identify this sign through discomfort. Specifically, the discomfort someone feels when there is no audience. A person who depends on validation feels restless when they're not being perceived. They struggle with silence. They become anxious when no one is praising them. Their actions lose their meaning unless someone is watching. It's not what they're doing that matters, it's who notices. This is why they often jump between trends, personas, or identities. They are constantly calibrating themselves to whatever seems most accepted at the moment. They treat life as a scoreboard and people as judges. And as long as they do that, they can never discover who they actually are beneath the layers of performance. A strong mind, however, values alignment more than admiration. Alignment means acting from principle rather than pressure. It means choosing values over image. It means speaking truth even when it makes you unpopular. It means pursuing goals because they matter to you, not because they impress others. It means standing alone when necessary, without collapsing. A person with inner alignment feels calm even when unnoticed. They don't need applause to validate their actions. They know why they do what they do, and that is enough. Their self-worth comes from consistency, discipline, and integrity, not from attention. Meanwhile, the person trapped in validation-seeking lives emotionally unanchored. They change themselves to avoid disapproval. They abandon dreams when no one applauds them. They exaggerate their struggles to gain sympathy. They censor their truth to avoid discomfort. And the tragedy is that even when they receive the validation they crave, it brings only temporary relief. External approval cannot fill an internal void. It only feeds it. The third sign of a fragile mind is the inability to move without being seen, the inability to choose without considering applause, and the inability to feel worthy without external confirmation. It is the habit of building identity out of impressions rather than convictions. Until someone stops asking, "Do they approve of me?" and starts asking, "Am I aligned with myself?" they will continue drifting through life as a reflection of others instead of a whole person. Because a fulfilled life is not built from how you are perceived, it is built from who you are when no one is watching. One of the most revealing signs of an undeveloped mind is the inability to recognize patterns in one's own behavior. A person may face the same problem over and over again, in relationships, work, habits, decisions, yet insist that life is simply unfair, unpredictable, or cursed with misfortune. They treat every setback as an isolated incident instead of a continuation of an underlying pattern they've never taken the time to examine. This creates a loop where nothing truly changes, even though everything around them seems to collapse repeatedly. At first glance, these people often appear unlucky. They move from job to job, never finding the right environment. They cycle through similar friendships, always ending with conflict or disappointment. They enter new relationships with optimism, only to recreate the same emotional landscape as before. They set goals, fall into the same obstacles, and then blame circumstances instead of noticing their recurring choices. But luck is rarely the cause. Patterns are the cause. And patterns are stubborn. They don't disappear just because someone wishes for a different outcome. When a person lacks the ability or willingness to reflect on their actions, they become trapped inside a behavioral loop. Their thoughts remain unchanged, their reactions automatic, their decisions predictable. And because those internal mechanisms stay constant, the world responds to them in the same way again and again. They repeat their past under the illusion that they're facing something new. This behavior is often fueled by avoidance. It feels easier to blame fate than to question one's own impulses. It feels safer to assume the world is hostile than to examine long-held habits. It feels more comforting to attribute misfortune to chance than to admit personal contribution. But each time someone chooses that comfort, the pattern tightens around them, limiting their ability to evolve. People stuck in this cycle often repeat similar phrases when things go wrong. "I guess this always happens to me." "Nothing I try ever works out." "I can't trust anyone." "I'm just unlucky." These sentences don't describe reality. They reinforce the narrative that prevents growth. They blind a person to the possibility that their own decisions, expectations, or unresolved wounds might be shaping their experiences. And because they don't question the origin of their difficulties, they continue to walk into situations that feel strangely familiar. A person with an undeveloped mind sees repetition as evidence that the world is unfair. A person with a developing mind sees repetition as a signal that something inside needs attention. The tragedy of repeated patterns is that they can last years, even decades, without being recognized. Someone may consistently choose partners who mirror the same emotional dynamics as past relationships, but they attribute this to coincidence. They may sabotage opportunities in subtle, predictable ways: procrastination, fear of discomfort, avoidance of responsibility, yet convince themselves they simply weren't ready. They may recreate the same emotional responses in different environments, unaware that they are carrying unresolved conflicts from one chapter to the next. Without reflection, repetition masquerades as fate. Growth becomes possible the moment a person pauses and asks, "Why does this feel familiar? What am I repeating without realizing it? What lesson have I refused to learn?" These questions are uncomfortable. They demand honesty, vulnerability, and patience. They strip away the illusion that external forces control everything. They reveal the role of patterns. Patterns shaped by beliefs, fears, habits, and unhealed experiences. A mature mind recognizes that repetition is not punishment, it is instruction. Life revisits the same lesson until the lesson is understood. Once the mind changes, the pattern dissolves. People who break out of these loops do so not by changing environments, but by changing themselves. They start observing their reactions, identifying triggers, noticing behavioral cycles, and making deliberate choices instead of falling into automatic ones. They stop blaming and start evaluating. They stop running and start understanding. They stop repeating and start rebuilding. Meanwhile, those who resist self-examination continue walking in circles, mistaking the familiar for the inevitable. They label predictable outcomes as bad luck, even though the real cause lies within decisions they never questioned. And because they refuse to acknowledge their patterns, the world reflects those patterns back to them endlessly. The fourth sign of a fragile mind is the inability to recognize repetition and the tendency to accept recurring struggles as fate. Until someone realizes that their patterns are not coincidences but consequences, they will continue reliving the same experiences under different names. A person becomes free the moment they understand that the world is not repeating. They are. The fifth sign of an undeveloped mind is one that hides in silence, in distractions, and in the spaces people refuse to enter: the avoidance of self-reflection. A person may function well on the surface, working, socializing, staying active, yet remain almost entirely disconnected from their inner world. They live externally, reacting to life instead of understanding themselves within it. And this disconnection becomes a quiet force that shapes their decisions, their relationships, and their emotional patterns without their awareness. Self-reflection requires courage. It forces a person to sit with their own contradictions, insecurities, unhealed wounds, and unresolved past. But instead of facing these truths, many people drown themselves in noise. They fill their days with constant stimulation, endless scrolling, non-stop conversations, impulsive entertainment, or any form of distraction that keeps the mind from slowing down long enough to reveal what lies beneath. To someone who fears introspection, silence is not peaceful, it is threatening. It strips away the protective layers they use to avoid themselves. The moment the world becomes quiet, their thoughts become loud. And those thoughts often bring questions they do not want to answer, emotions they don't want to feel, and memories they don't want to revisit. So they continue running, not physically, but mentally. People who avoid self-reflection often disguise this avoidance in convenient phrases. I don't like thinking too much. It's better to leave the past alone. I'm fine as I am. I don't want to overanalyze everything. But these statements are not signs of peace. They are signs of fear. Peace comes from understanding, not avoidance. Avoidance might feel comfortable, but it quietly deepens confusion. A person who refuses to look inward loses sight of why they behave the way they do. They don't see their own patterns clearly. They don't understand their emotional triggers. They repeat reactions without knowing their source. They carry unresolved baggage from chapter to chapter, thinking the next situation will magically be different. Without self-reflection, a person becomes a stranger to themselves. They may feel sadness without knowing its root. They may sabotage opportunities without recognizing the fear behind the behavior. They may choose the same type of partner over and over without understanding the emotional wound driving the attraction. They may repeat mistakes while insisting they had no part in creating them. Life becomes a cycle instead of a progression. This lack of introspection also creates emotional instability. When someone doesn't understand their internal landscape, everything external feels heavier. Minor inconveniences trigger outsized reactions. Constructive feedback feels like a personal attack. Normal challenges feel overwhelming. They don't have the internal clarity to interpret their experiences accurately, so they respond defensively, impulsively, or with confusion. The fifth sign reveals itself in the way a person handles stillness. Ask them to pause, and they fidget. Ask them to describe their emotions, and they generalize. Ask them what they truly want, and they hesitate. Ask them why a pattern keeps repeating, and they change the subject. They don't avoid reflection because they lack time. They avoid it because reflection demands honesty. And honesty forces them to acknowledge the gap between who they are and who they could be. A mature mind moves toward clarity. It understands that introspection is not self-punishment, but self-navigation. It does not dwell endlessly on past wounds, but it doesn't bury them either. Instead, it studies them with calm attention, extracting lessons the way a craftsman studies their tools. It recognizes that knowing oneself is not optional. It is essential. Without this awareness, choices become reactions, relationships become projections, and the future becomes a repetition of the past. Meanwhile, a person who avoids reflection builds their life on emotional guesswork. They depend on distractions to keep uncomfortable truths hidden. They cling to shallow routines to avoid deeper questions. They move quickly, not because life demands speed, but because slowing down risks exposure. And the more they avoid themselves, the more overwhelming their inner world becomes. The fifth sign of a fragile mind is the refusal to look inward. It is the habit of outrunning one's own truth, of filling silence with noise, of resisting the very clarity that would bring peace. Until a person is willing to explore their inner landscape, their motives, wounds, tendencies, and unresolved emotions, they remain governed by forces they cannot see. Real transformation begins not when someone changes their environment, but when they finally turn toward themselves instead of away. The sixth sign of an undeveloped mind is one that often goes unnoticed because it disguises itself as power. The belief that emotional intensity equals real strength. Many people grow up thinking that being loud, forceful, dramatic, or emotionally explosive is a sign of passion or authority. They believe that reacting quickly means being decisive, that defending themselves aggressively means they're confident, and that overwhelming others with intensity means they're in control. But none of these things are true strength. They're merely symptoms of a mind that has never learned restraint. Emotional intensity is not the same as emotional power. One is raw instinct. The other is disciplined awareness. A person who lacks mental maturity often lives on the edge of their emotions. Every feeling becomes urgent. Every disagreement becomes a conflict. Every inconvenience turns into a justification for tension. They navigate the world with a constant sense of pressure, as if life were a battlefield and every interaction required them to stand guard. Their intensity comes not from clarity, but from vulnerability they've never acknowledged. This type of person frequently interprets their reactions as proof of authenticity. I'm just a passionate person. I say what needs to be said. I don't hide how I feel. But raw emotion is not courage, it is unchecked impulse. It requires no discipline, no thought, no awareness. It is the default state of someone who has never learned to sit with discomfort without exploding or collapsing. Observe how they behave under pressure. They raise their voice quickly, even when the situation doesn't demand it. They interrupt often, not to express clarity but to overpower the room. They escalate tension instead of diffusing it. Their presence feels heavy, unpredictable, and unsettling. And yet, to them, this feels like strength, because intensity is the only version of power they have ever known. True strength functions differently. It is quiet, stable, and deliberate. It doesn't flare up, it remains composed. A mature mind recognizes that emotional control is not suppression, it is direction. It channels emotion with intention rather than letting emotion drag it like a current. It understands that force without clarity is chaos, and chaos destroys far more than it protects. A person who confuses intensity with strength often ends up damaging the very things they claim to care about. Their relationships become strained, because intensity doesn't create safety, it creates distance. Their opportunities shrink, because intensity doesn't inspire trust, it creates unpredictability. Even their self-image becomes distorted, because they begin to equate volatility with vitality, mistaking turbulence for depth. Intensity can be mistaken for confidence, but confidence does not need to perform. Intensity can look like conviction, but conviction does not need to overpower. Intensity can resemble passion, but passion does not need to suffocate. What this person truly lacks is emotional stability, the ability to experience strong feelings without letting those feelings take control. They haven't learned the art of pausing between stimulus and response. They haven't cultivated the ability to breathe through discomfort before acting. They haven't understood that strength reveals itself most clearly not in outbursts, but in the ability to remain grounded while everything around them pushes for a reaction. The sixth sign reveals itself in patterns. They react faster than they think. They speak to assert dominance, not clarity. They confuse tension with presence. And beneath that intensity lies something fragile. Fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of losing control. Intensity becomes armor, but armor is not the same as strength. A truly strong mind does not fear calmness. It does not fear silence. It does not fear listening before speaking. It does not fear being wrong, nor does it fear taking a moment to choose the wisest response. Where an undeveloped mind erupts, a developed mind reflects. Where an undeveloped mind seeks to win, a developed mind seeks to understand. Where an undeveloped mind pushes outward, a developed mind looks inward. The sixth sign of a fragile mind is the habit of mistaking emotional storms for personal power. But storms are loud precisely because they lack stability. A steady foundation makes no sound. Strength is controlled. Strength is intentional. Strength is calm. And until a person learns to separate intensity from actual inner power, they will continue believing that being loud is the same as being strong, and that reacting fast is the same as being wise, even though the opposite is true. If you want to measure someone's strength, don't look at how loudly they react. Look at how deeply they remain composed. And now that you've reached the end of this journey, take a moment to reflect. Which of these 6 signs appears in the world around you? Which one appears in you? If this video opened your eyes, leave a like, subscribe, and comment which sign resonated the most. Your engagement helps this message reach more people who are ready to grow and break out of their old patterns.